Okay, so people seem to like the video that I did where I talked about DIY approaches to recording. So I thought I could get a little bit more granular about how I set up drums. And I thought that the easiest way to do this would just be to show you a diagram and kind of draw in a couple of different methods that you can use for miking drums. I'll probably go through kind of like what I know of as like 2, 3, and 4 mic setups. And I'll go over these mics that I have and kind of where you can put them on the kit. So firstly, we have a Behringer C-2 here. That's a condenser mic. I'd probably use it as an overhead mic kind of on top of the kit out on a boom stand. Then we have an Audio Technica Pro 63. I would probably use that to mic maybe a snare or a tom. This here, the MXL Drum Cube Pro, is probably also best for miking a tom, although you could use it for kick as well. I have used it for kick in the past and it does work, although it's pretty sensitive. These two mics are condenser mics. They require phantom power, and this is a dynamic microphone. These two probably take in a little bit more of a solid EQ range, whereas this one has maybe a little bit more of a narrow EQ range. You also have the option to sort of lower the input amount directly at the microphone with the Behringer C-2. It has a -8 dB function that allows you to make things a little bit quieter. That's pretty good when you're working with a drum kit. You know, you've got really loud sounds, really splashy cymbals, and you want to quiet things down a little bit before it gets to the board. So these are just 3 examples of mics that you could use in this situation. They're all pretty cheap. This one's probably the most expensive, and I think it's maybe $100 at this point. You can't even buy it new. They stopped making them. You can buy a pair of these for probably about $100, and these will set you back maybe only 60 or 70 bucks at this point. At the bare minimum, you're probably going to need about 2 mic stands, boom mic stands, to make this happen, although 3 is ideal and 4 is great. Okay, so to start off with, you're probably going to want to have 2 overheads. This is maybe the bare minimum miking setup, or 1 overhead is probably the most bare bones you could go. And if you had 1 overhead mic, you would probably want to try and place it kind of as dead center over the kit as possible, maybe somewhere here on a boom. If you wanted to set up 2 overhead mics, you can set them up in basically 2 different ways that I'm familiar with. You just have one kind of chilling over here and maybe one chilling over here. And the most critical thing is that you make sure that the distance between the snare drum and each of those points is roughly equal, because otherwise you're going to have phasing problems and there's going to be kind of a natural echo to your recording sound. So one way that you can kind of counteract that is that rather than having your condenser mics placed out apart from each other, you can put them dead center over the kit, but face them in 2 opposite directions and kind of achieve a similar effect. And the reason why you would want to have these 2 stands at all is because you can achieve a stereo sound with your mix as opposed to a mono sound if you just had that 1 mic. If you want to move beyond having overheads, another thing that you can add is a kick drum mic. You can either put the kick drum mic inside the drum itself and save yourself the trouble of having to get a stand or even something to prop it up on. But you might run into the problem of having too much attack, too much sound of the actual beater head being struck by the kick pedal. My recommendation is really to pull it out from there rather than have it inside. Ideally, you kind of have it outside of the kick drum, a short distance away, with the face of the microphone facing in toward the kick drum. Ideally, you have it placed where the sound hole of the kick drum is so it can get a lot of oomph. But yeah, placing the mic outside of the kick drum is going to make everything sound a lot boomier. You'll get a lot more low end out of it for sure. So the 4th mic that you would probably add to this setup would be a snare mic. And then after that, you'd move on to toms. But I think at that point, we've kind of moved beyond anything that I would consider a DIY recording setup. You're definitely going to need a stand for your snare mic, and you're probably going to want to place it on the beater face somewhere kind of in here, or maybe in here if you can squeeze it in, one of those 2 spots. You want it to be unobtrusive, and that can be kind of tricky with the snare mic. If you want to get really fancy, you can also mic the underside of the snare, and you're going to get a lot more resonance as opposed to the beater face where you get a lot more attack. It's kind of a similar thing to, you know, the kick drum mic being really close to the face or far away. And you can mix those 2 separately to get more resonance or less resonance depending upon what you like. So the more mics you add to a setup in general, the more dynamic you can get with the mixing after the fact. I personally think that you really need at least 3 mics at the bare minimum, 2 overheads and a kick. It really starts to sound good once you have a snare mic as well. That 4 mic setup can be really, really crisp. I will say that it's easier to get a good mix with a low number of mics when you're playing much quieter, and that's not something that's very easy to do when you're trying to do Screamo, really, or any kind of punk music for that matter. Really, the more mics you can throw at the problem, the better. You'll thank yourself in the long run. You'll probably be able to make a more interesting sound in the mixing process, but I can respect that gets expensive, and for that reason, there's a balance to be struck. All in all, if we're not including the actual materials that you need to record this, like a recording device as in a computer and an interface, or at the bare minimum some kind of like 4-track recorder, we're talking a few $100s to get this setup going, and that's not cheap. However, if you were to go to a studio, you would probably be paying a lot more for time, and then you wouldn't own the materials afterwards, so you couldn't do it again. And, it's a one-time investment. A lot of this stuff is going to work for a really long time. You'll get a ton of records out of it. When you're recording, you probably want to make sure that your monitoring setup is really good. Make sure that whoever's drumming has a pair of headphones that are very sound isolating, and they like to wear them and they can hear really well when things are played through them. You'll probably want to scratch track of what the thing that you're going to play along with sounds like if you're not doing this live, and I recommend tracking separately if you're trying to make an album DIY that sounds as good as possible. You'll also want a click track in there too, and you want that to be a separate track from your scratch track so that you can play with the volume of each. Whoever's drumming is probably going to want really, really loud scratch and click, probably more click than scratch. So the more that you can boost that, the better. The other thing I've noticed when tracking drums is that most people don't really wait long enough when the take is over before they start talking and stuff. So it's a good thing to run over with your drummer ahead of time that they should let all the cymbals ring out at the end of the song for a really good period of time, because you're going to have to mix in some fades and whatnot. Overall, this is pretty easy. Your mic placement, you just want to run XLRs into whatever you're recording, and then set the level so that nothing is, peaking out, meaning that it's, hitting the red line. And if that is the case, then you're going to get a lot of distorted stuff after the fact. So while you're tracking, you want to make sure that everything's staying in place. You want to make sure that the, mics are close to the faces. In the case of the snare, if something gets jostled in the process of playing, you're going to have a different sound. So it's something that you definitely want to be paying attention to. But recording is a lot of fun, and recording drums is maybe one of the most interesting and challenging parts of DIY recording. I hope you have a lot of fun giving it a try.